I hung my head, I hung my head, I hung my head, I hung my head.
Well, that was the second episode of Arrow Season 3, and quite possibly one of the most emotionally intense episodes yet. I mean, we've had intense episodes up to this point, and certainly they've killed off central or even supporting characters before, but this was really the first time where we got to grieve for them, where we spent an entire episode in grieving. Well, we kind of got a little bit of that with Moira's death, but this episode was completely focused on that, because think about it. When Tommy died, we had the entire summer to digest that. When Moira died, we got a little bit of grieving, but for the most part, it was kind of set up and trying to get Oliver back in the game for Deathstroke's eventual takeover of the city. This one, the episode was strictly about coping with the loss. And for, I hate to use this term like for a comic book show, but for something that is so often written off as just being, silly costume superheroes, this did tackle some very real emotions, and honestly, it was pretty depressing to watch. Because, like I said, a lot of it was mourning and, trying to move past it. Like, if we could have done this different, if we could have done that different. And really, the action of this episode was really centered around getting the guy who did it. Which they don't. Spoiler. The trail goes cold, which, again, I think was a very smart move. I think it would have been very easy for them to track down the guy who did it, who we learn goes by the code name Komodo. I think it would have been very easy to track down that guy in one episode and just be done with that. But to have the trail actually go cold, I think was a very mature move, because, again, it kind of goes back to that rule that we don't really always get closure, especially in situations like this. I mean, I don't mean to preach, but again, I just like how that went, and I like how that they did not resolve that in one episode. And aside from that, I liked how they tied in the death of Sara with, how this whole situation and how these characters will eventually end up if they keep at this double life that they lead. And this episode actually led to some very intense scenes with Stephen Amell, Emily Bett Rickards, and even Katie Cassidy. Yeah, for the most part, I thought this episode was very well written. I thought they spent the appropriate amount of time grieving for Sara. I still don't agree with the decision to kill her off so unceremoniously and so suddenly, but it shows that if this episode has proven anything, it has proven that the Arrow writers and the actors, those involved for bringing us these weekly episodes, have not lost their mojo. They still got it, as it were. And again, what I thought was a really clever move was to really tie it in with, how will this all end up? I mean, this double life that we lead, Oliver even says, that could be me on that table someday. I mean, am I going to die leading this life? I don't want to die leading this life. So some interesting issues were raised. And true, they could have focused more on that, but again, I think by obligation they had to include some action in this episode, so they had Oliver going after Komodo, which as a villain, he served his purpose, but there was nothing really particularly memorable about him. Really, he was just generic bad guy. We didn't really see much in the way of his personality. I mean, he was just some street assassin who just happened to prefer a bow. Frankly, Peter Stormare was better in the last episode. And again, finally addressing the absence of Thea, which I don't have a problem with. Thea sucks. But again, addressing that absence of Thea and how Oliver is really trying to reach out to Thea, if only for his own comfort, but also out of a concern for her safety. Again, this episode really was kind of an emotional roller coaster in the best way possible. Again, some very, very good performances, and I think one of the unsung heroes of this episode would actually be Colin Donnell as Tommy Merlin, who appears via flashback, in the flashback with Hong Kong, which I'm starting to like Carl Yoon. I think that's how you say his last name. He's the younger brother of the bad guy from Olympus Has Fallen, and he also played the bad guy in Real Steel. But I digress. Carl Yoon plays the guy who Oliver is partnered with in Hong Kong. So once again, Hong Kong, I think it provides an interesting change in scenery. I like how they're still addressing that the world still goes on in the flashbacks despite only focusing on Oliver. So including Tommy, A, you could do that because the character is still alive at that point in time, and B, I like how I like how they brought Colin Donnell back. I mean, he really was kind of portraying the more naive version of Tommy that we saw at the beginning of season 1, as opposed to the very frustrated, dramatic, or emotionally distraught Tommy we saw at the end. So props to Colin Donnell. But in addition, we also got a wonderfully understated performance from Stephen Amell. One might think this episode would be just the actors crying for the whole episode, but again, Stephen Amell, we address how he really doesn't want to die in here, but also we address the fact that he doesn't really seem to have a much of a visible reaction to Sarah's death, or at least not on the scale of someone like Laurel or Felicity. He's trying to maintain his presence as the leader, and throughout this whole episode, you see him really in this internal struggle, and I thought that was wonderfully acted by Stephen Amell. And again, we get some very very heart-wrenching scenes from Emily Bett Rickards and Katie Cassidy. But one problem I did have with the episode is one of the scenes toward the end where Laurel is going to tell her father about Sarah because he doesn't know yet. And she's just about to tell him, and then she backs out at the last second. And as the scene was playing, I was like, oh God, they're not doing this, are they? And she said, I just want you to know that I'm sorry. And it struck me that she was not going to tell him. And I was like, son of a... Just when I was starting to tolerate you, Laurel, you have to go and do that. I still don't think she'll make a very good Black Canary. I really don't. But, that's another story. Yeah, on top of resorting to one of the tired old cliches like, oh, I can't tell you because I love you too much, we are going to... I think it actually separates us from being able to identify with Detective Lance, or Captain Lance, as he is now, in the way that we normally can when he is in the loop. Because things are going to be significantly more grim, and he's not going to know why. He's going to be completely in the dark. And again, I agree with Oliver here. He deserves to know about his daughter's death. I mean, granted, you could make the excuse, well, maybe his heart can't take it. I mean, he's having heart problems. He has to take these pills at a certain time. But even so, I think that was a very self-righteous thing to do. I think that was I think that was kind of uncalled for. But aside from that, the action is still great. The performances were fantastic this episode. I'm consistently impressed by how the show is able to generate such emotional intensity out of these actors who, again, I've never heard of. Emily Bett Rickards I had never heard of before this show. Colton Haynes, I'm told, was on Teen Wolf, but again, I don't watch Teen Wolf, so I wouldn't know. But even he got some interesting material to work with. I mean, considering he knows that Thea is not going to call Oliver back, and him grappling with how he was going to tell him that. Already, I think they're handling Roy in season 3 significantly better than they did in season 2. Season 2, he was very emo, he was very angry, and honestly, it got pretty old. But in season 3, he's much more understated. He's much more identifiable now that he doesn't have the Mirakuru in his system. But again, at the end of the episode, we see Thea with Merlin, with John Barrowman, and she's training with Merlin's guys, and she's she supposedly knows how to fight now. Again, I don't like Thea. I've never liked Thea. Although I don't harbor such hostility against some of these characters to the point where I'm willing to send death threats to the actor, like I hear some people do. I have nothing against Katie Cassidy. I have nothing against Willa Holland. I just don't like some of these characters. But again, I think the fact that they balance these characters out with a plethora of other likable characters, I mean, I think works to the show's benefit. And Brendan Routh was also very good this episode. I like the fact that they're actually giving him a little bit more dimension than, hey, I'm this snarky businessman, or I'm the cocky Tony Stark-esque businessman. So yeah, very accomplished episode all around. I definitely hit me more emotionally than last episode, which I think was the intention, or I know was the intention. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see where they go from here. Unless it involves Thea, in which case I will probably find it very boring.